we did receive emails, and we're thankful that people feel comfortable enough and getting their thoughts across. And there were a number of emails sent, and some of them are like-minded and similar. And we are making them a priority, and everyone will get a response. And again, it's important that people really share their feelings, so that we make sure that we have all the information going forward. But thank you for sending in those comments or thoughts, so that we can make sure that we have clear representation. And some people might not be as comfortable saying stuff publicly as well. So we appreciate, getting the information to us.
Great. So anything else in the announcements category that anybody has before we get to our two presentations? All right. So I'm not sure if I've seen our first presenter arrive in the meeting yet. Is Rashida here? And I wonder if, it could be an issue with the link, or who communicated directly with her? Was that Trupti?
That was me, Philip. I'm looking at my email and just making sure if I'm seeing her or not.
So I suppose I should wait to introduce her until she's here. But maybe we'll start by saying thank you to Trom for your work in organizing this first hour of our time and inviting a great speaker to share with us her expertise related to the experience of renters. And then also appreciation to Kelly and Tony Barranco and anyone else that any of you all may have enlisted in organizing the second hour of our time today and bringing in an expert to talk about real estate financing. So I think there's a lot of good learning ahead of us on these couple hours. We'll do the same kind of format we have recently, where please don't interrupt as we're going, but we'll build a queue of people with questions as we go, and then try to get through as many of those as possible in the time that we have. Any updates on Rashida?
I just sent her an email. There's a 202. Oh, here she is.
Oh, good.
And I'm going to make her a co-host.
Great. Hello, Rashida. Can you hear me?
Yes, hello. I'm so sorry I'm late. I translated the time incorrectly.
Oh, no, very glad that you're here. My name is Philip. I'm one of the co-chairs of the task force. We are so glad to have you here. Thank you for bringing your expertise and taking the time to share it with us. Rashida Phillips is the Director of Housing for a national advocacy organization called Policy Link, doing work on tenants' rights and housing and land use. She previously worked in Philadelphia with Community Legal Services there as their managing attorney of housing policy, and has many awards and distinctions in her work as an advocate with renters across the country. And we're just so glad that on very short notice, you were able to make the time to share your expertise with us today. So just before you got on, I said we're going to hold questions and build a queue as you go, if that's okay. There's 41 of us, so we found that if we don't do it that way, that there's lots of interruptions. And so go ahead with your presentation, and then we'll take the queue of questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Let me figure out how to share my screen. Okay, are you able to see my screen? And you're not seeing my notes, right?
Correct.
Okay, awesome. All right, well, thank you again for having me. Appreciate just having the opportunity to come and speak with you all. My name again is Rashida Phillips, and I am with Policy Link, and just want to talk about, here to provide some information about how the rental market is affecting tenants, and about some of the challenges that folks are having with finding and keeping affordable places to live. So again, from Policy Link, our mission is we're a national research and action institute advancing racial and economic equity by lifting up what works. Our population is the 100 million residents who are at or below the national poverty level. And yeah, so I'm going to start off with just talking about some of the challenges of the rental market. Some of the stuff, right, folks may already know, but I'm hoping to give it a little bit of context around just what's happening in different spheres of the rental market. And so as folks probably already know, right, stable housing is really out of reach for many in the state, right? So on the left, I have a map of from the National Low Income Housing Coalition that shows that in 2021, the minimum wage hours that are needed in order to afford rent. And so they look at, what's needed to afford a 1 or 2 bedroom. And so they look at this across the country, and they have some specific information about Minnesota. And so what they show is that stable housing is out of reach for thousands in the state due to rising rents and stagnant wages. And so what this means is that in Minnesota, the fair market rent for a 2-bedroom apartment is about $1,133. In order to afford this level of rent and utilities without paying more than 30% of income towards housing, and anything over and above that 30% of income is considered a housing cost burden. But in order to afford just a 2-bedroom apartment at a low rate, $1,000, a household must earn $3,775 monthly, or about $45,000 annually in order to afford that. And then assuming a 40-hour work week, 52 weeks per year, this level of income translates into an hourly housing wage of $21.78. And as you all probably already know, right, in the state, the minimum wage is $10.08. And so it's just, housing expenses are really not affordable for your average worker who otherwise would have to work 2.2, nearly 2.5 full-time jobs in order to afford a typical 2-bedroom house. And then when we look at renter insecurity in Minnesota, and just to give you all a note, I'm switching databases, right? So this comes from the Policy Links National Equity Atlas, and all you folks can go online, nationalequityatlas.com, and it shows you, it gives a breakdown again across states, across cities, on different factors. And so this is from our rent debt dashboard. And the dashboard provides current data on the number and characteristics of renters who are behind on rent for the US states and 15 metro areas, as well as the estimates of the amount of back rent owed. We're able to tap into some of the dashboards for the distribution of federal emergency rental assistance. And so what it shows for Minnesota is that most renters with arrears have not yet applied for assistance or are waiting for a response. And so we have a situation where about 57% of people did not apply. There's various reasons why people were not able to access or didn't apply. About 10% denied, 22% waiting, and 11% have received. So pretty low abysmal numbers in terms of people being able to access assistance to pay their rent. And then we also know, right, that this has a particular impact on particular communities. And so Black, Latinx, Native American, and other renters of color were disproportionately housing insecure before the pandemic, right? And so this led to exacerbations during the pandemic for these particular communities. But prior to the pandemic, we had a situation where the communities experiencing the highest burden of household costs, as well as low, wages, Black communities at about 47%, Latino communities, 46%, Native American communities, the highest at 50%, right? And so, and then comparatively speaking, Asian and Pacific Islander communities, about 31%, and white communities, 31%. And then just another sort of part of this in terms of renter insecurity. So we see, right, not only is there an overall shortage of affordable rental homes across the country, right, but they're sort of rarely located in high opportunity neighborhoods. And so when people can't afford, to rent in places where there's higher opportunities, it's going to have impacts on their ability to access jobs, access good schools, et cetera. And so anyway, those behind on rent, again, are overwhelmingly low income households who experienced job and income losses during the pandemic. And then just in terms of the total rent debt across the state, we're seeing about $144 million in total estimated rent debt, which translates into about 75,000 families behind on rent and 66,000 children across the state. So now we're going to get a little bit into, more, zoom in a little bit more, right? And so this map that I'm showing you is a new map that PolicyLink is putting out soon in a report that we call the Geographies of Opportunity report. And so what this report is going to show folks, right, is that working class households face a shrinking geography of opportunity in Metro America. And so across the 100 most populous metropolitan areas around the country, the number of zip codes where the median market rents are affordable to low-income households has significantly declined. So between the years 2013 and 2019, there was across the metro area that you all live in, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Bloomington, there was a significant drop in the number of affordable zip codes. And so this first map shows you 2013. There were 47 zip codes that were affordable across the metro area to families that are at or below 80% of area median income. So what you see in gray on this map are zip codes that are not affordable for that selected income level. And then, so again, across the metro area, 2013, 47 zip codes, and I believe St. Paul is right around here, if I'm not mistaken, but please someone correct me. And so that translates into $101,619 in terms of area median income at 80%. So this is 2013. Then we fast forward to 2019, right, where we see again, there are shrinking numbers of zip codes. So I'll just flip back. This is 2013. And now 2019, right? And so we, or you all, right, across the metro area have seen a 57% change in available zip codes that are affordable to someone making 80% of AMI. So it dropped from that 47 to 20 zip codes that are available to people at that area median income. Again, this changes when we add race to it, right? And so sadly, this is the number of zip codes across the metro area that were affordable to Black households making median household income. And so that is 0 zip codes. 0 zip codes between 2013 and 2019 that are available to Black families who are making median, or affordable rather, to Black families who are making median household income. And so that just goes to show you Black and Latino households have fewer choices when it comes to affordable neighborhoods. Only 7% of zip codes in the top 100 metros had median market rents affordable to the median Black households on the income spectrum in 2019. This is Latino metro area renters and shrinking affordability. So here we see only 4 zip codes in 2013 across the metro were available to Latino households making median household income. And so what you see in orange, those are neighborhoods that are of lower opportunity, right? And so just looking at opportunity index, the orange is lower opportunity areas, and then purple is high opportunity areas. And so just even looking at the types of neighborhoods that were available within the zip codes that were affordable, very few that have access to high opportunities. And then the last map I'll show is for white families. So white families across the metro area are also seeing shrinking affordability, right? But generally speaking, have much more areas that are available to them at their income level. And so for white families, the households making median household income in 2013 had 178 zip codes that were affordable to them. In 2019, 162 zip codes. So saw a 9% change. But again, even for white families who typically, right, have a little bit better housing, or a lot better housing access, you still see the shrinking zip codes of affordability. And so again, 2013, 178, 2019, 162 zip codes affordable to white families making median household income. And just again, to explain the colors, blue means very high opportunity. Pink is kind of in the middle. And then yellow is the very low opportunity. So again, even when we're talking about the quality of neighborhoods that are available to other types of families, there are more high opportunity zip codes that are affordable to white families than there are to other families. So now I'm going to get into St. Paul specifically and just talk about some of the neighborhood poverty. And again, all these maps you'll be able to find just going to Policy Link's National Equity Atlas. The maps on affordability, shrinking affordability, are not available yet to the public, but they will be very soon. So you'll be able to also go on there, and the data is downloadable so you can get these maps and these charts as well. So St. Paul in 2019, again, right, we're seeing neighborhood poverty and also putting the lens of race on it. And so what we see is that in 2019, the white population had the lowest share of people living in high poverty neighborhoods at 8.7%, and the Black population had the highest share at 27.5%. And so just in general, right, in Minnesota, in St. Paul, you know, we see, again, some differences across racial and ethnic groups, and just some really large gaps in terms of poverty levels. And I actually had tried to pull a map that overlaid poverty and tenure, but I wasn't able to get that quickly. But if folks are interested in that information, I can send that to you later. And then housing cost burden in St. Paul, also right in 2019, renters with incomes at below 200% of poverty were the most burdened by housing costs among all income groups. And so the most expensive areas with housing, you know, in terms of housing, again, you need to be making in some of the most expensive areas $25 an hour, right, at least to be able to afford your rent in most neighborhoods. And so people with less money are spending a greater proportion of their incomes on housing, which just, you know, in some ways doesn't make a lot of sense. And this really puts people at a disadvantage in other areas of life as they have less to devote to things like education and health. And so for most low income household, housing is going to be the single largest expense that they have to deal with. Then we get, again, you know, by race, right? And where we see that the folks who are experiencing this are racialized households. So in 2019, renters with incomes at or below 200% of poverty were the most burdened by housing costs among all income groups. In 2019, white households had the lowest housing burden for renters, 42%. And Black households had the highest housing burden, which is 56%. And again, for folks who don't know, your housing cost burden is, you know, determined by how much you're paying your rent towards your monthly household income. Monthly household expenses, and anything over 30% is considered housing cost burden. And then lastly, just want to look at St. Paul tenure by race, right, in terms of home ownership opportunities. And so all residents are not able to achieve home ownership opportunities in St. Paul, unfortunately. So in 2019, Black households had the lowest home ownership rates at 18%. White households had the highest home ownership rate at 62%, right? And so it begs the question that if home ownership is unlikely or unachievable for renters of color, most of them will need to or have to rent, right? Otherwise, you know, they don't really have many other options. All right. So now I want to just talk about the benefits of a well-tailored rent stabilization policy. You know, this is just kind of cobbled together from things that we've seen around the country. You know, you all and your example as well, right? And what your example shows, what your policy shows, right, is that designing these kind of policies is really like a puzzle. And so, right, if a community doesn't have the key pieces, it's just not, the puzzle can't be completed, right? And it's a puzzle that everyone has to sort of play a role in creating. And so what is rent stabilization? I'm talking to a crowd who knows what rent stabilization is, right? But just to give you the general, right, it's something that sets maximal allowable rent increases to restrict price gouging. It's something that is meant to help stabilize housing costs and grant greater ability to afford housing costs. It also provides consistent and predictable rent increases. It protects against destabilization. It reduces sudden evictions. It helps to reduce tenant turnover costs as well. You know, if a policy establishes a rent board, that rent board often serves as mediators between landlords and tenants, right? It can help level the playing field in the landlord-tenant relationship. When I was practicing law back in Philly and representing tenants, so much of the situation was, you know, circumstances when people are ending up in eviction court was about that relationship breakdown. And so much of it was finding interventions and ways to fix what, you know, miscommunications or the relationship breakdown. And so a rent board can also serve that role so that folks can avoid, you know, costly court systems that often don't resolve the problem, often just stretches out the problem in time and you know, the cost amount, and then the cost to the people who are evicted, obviously, right, plays out in many different ways. And then for cities who create rental registries to track compliance and enforce penalties, it helps to maintain housing habitability and greater transparency in the landlord-tenant relationship. So these are some of the benefits that come about from rent stabilization policies and why cities and communities choose to utilize them. Often they're framed as something that is about rental affordability. And while that is true, and that's often a goal of that, right? A lot of it is also about stability of the community. It's about repairing some of the relationships that are happening between landlords and tenants to enable people to live in their communities, stay in their communities, and have tenure in their communities without being homeowners, right? Because again, not everyone is going to be able to be homeowners. Why rent stabilization? So why do communities choose to do these policies? And we're seeing them, right? There's been this sort of revival of communities looking to rent stabilization policies to address some of the issues that they're seeing. And why is that, right? It's because it provides a near-term solution in a lot of situations. It has the potential to immediately address the crisis at scale. You don't have to wait to build if home ownership is more unlikely or unachievable, particularly for renters of color, right? In the meantime, affordable building is also a worthy goal that we also have to do at the same time. But until then, people still need to be able to afford their rents. And so it is a tool that allows people to sort of immediately address some of the crisis at scale around affordability. For the average worker who's not going to also qualify for subsidized housing or encounter lengthy wait lists, housing on a private market is often the only option as well, right? So I just talked about neighborhood poverty levels, people not being able to rent. And, for some, the answer may be build more public housing, we need more subsidies, right? That is often also not really a possibility, right? Because increasingly we're seeing subsidies get lowered, the Fed's not putting as much into public housing budgets and things like that. And so we do need alternative solutions. We need a bunch of solutions, a bunch of tools that are going to help to address people being able to access housing that doesn't cost burden them. And so it's cost effective in that way, right? It has the potential to be cost effective, particularly regarding turnover for cities, hopefully, right? It's important to make it cost effective. But one of the things that is important, right, and hopefully this resonates with you all, right, is that it's important to make it cheaper and easier to build and renovate housing. So these policies need to be paired with other policies. It can't just be the rent control policy itself, but you also have to understand how the whole ecosystem works, right, and make it cheaper and easier to build. Often the primary constraint on housing supply in America's cities, right, is exclusionary zoning. It's regulatory hurdles. It's all those things that drive up the cost of developing and producing new homes. And so, when we're talking about these policies, they absolutely need to be talked about in tandem with other policies that make it easier for these things to work together. And then, helping to target really what the real concern is often of supply constraint, which is, again, some of those exclusionary zoning policies that communities have, or just regulatory barriers that prevent people from being able to build. And then, again, why rent stabilization, low income families and families of color are spending greater proportions of their income on housing. This puts them really just at a disadvantage in life in general. In other areas of life, they have less money to devote to things like education and health. I'll talk about this a little bit more later and give you some more data around some of these issues, right? But all in all, right, this is a fairness issue. And I think while we've been told all our lives life isn't fair, right? That's what my mom told me growing up. We do have a problem with masses of people who are predictably left out, are living in unfair circumstances. And so fairness isn't like this abstract thing around destiny, but we can design fairness and we can, and therefore, some of these systems do need to be redesigned, ideally with all stakeholders involved so that it works for everyone. And then the cascading benefits, obviously considering the future benefits and generational impacts of stabilized housing in a community versus more of the same entrenched systemic inequity that causes, that's just not cost effective for cities in general. If that's your goal is to be cost effective, the current system is not that. So, right, when we have a system where people can afford their rent, where people are stabilized in their communities, there's cascading benefits around economic, health, education, climate friendliness, development, et cetera. So I'll go into that a little bit more in a second. And then just in terms of some principles for effective rent stabilization, you all definitely have a model policy, right? And what it's shown is that it doesn't have to be a protection versus a supply problem, right? That it can really be a tailored approach that works for the community that strives to protect existing residents, that builds for new ones, that tries to level set. Right. And with the understanding that building is going to take time again, right? Like we're not saying and or, it really is about a both and. And so building takes time. And so the housing you're in while we're waiting for more affordable housing or not affordable housing to be built, the housing you're in is usually the most affordable. And so, one thing is that housing policies in the city should be complementary. I already talked about this a little bit, right? But pairing rent control with robust tenant protections and systems to maintain safe quality homes. And then again, right, reducing some of the regulatory burdens that make it hard for folks to, for developers and others to be able to engage in some of these policies. And so you have to pair these policies together. It can't just be siloed out as its own solution or tool, because then it's not going to be as effective as it could be. And then, right, the policy goal is hopefully to maximize neighborhood stability, right? Again, often these policies are talked about in ways that are just like about affordability, right? And using rent control as a tool, or rent stabilization as a tool to make rents more affordable. But really, like, let's think about it as maximizing neighborhood stability, right? Affordability is absolutely a part of that, right? But it's more about stability. It's more about people being able to predict what their rents are going to be so that they can plan for their lives and they can do what they need to do for their families. Again, just want to continue to emphasize, families are paying higher, lower income families are paying higher costs when it comes to housing. Lower income families that are larger families are paying higher costs when it comes to trying to access housing with larger bedroom size. Particularly for public housing, subsidized housing, what's considered affordable housing, 3 and 4 bedrooms or bedroom sizes that match your family size are just not possible in a lot of cases, right? And so it is hard to find older housing stock, newer housing stock with what's needed. And so again, where families live is often the best place for them. And so policies that avoid and prevent displacement, avoid people having to go out on the market and not being able to access housing that they can actually afford or that fits their family size is another goal. So again, that stability part. And so also just to emphasize, right, again, these policies are complementary. You also want to make sure that there's just cause eviction, there's these other sort of things that close some of the loopholes that prevent families from actually being able to benefit from rent stabilization policies. In the last part of my presentation, I just want to talk about some of the benefits of rent stabilization policies. And again, when I'm saying rent stabilization, I'm talking about housing stability, right? Affordability is built into that. But the main goal for a lot of these policies should be around housing stability. And historically, when we have talked about rent control and rent stabilization, right, and the analyses that have come out about them, they've often just kind of focused on the benefits of rent control to money saved, money saved by the beneficiaries, money saved by the people who live in rent controlled units. And they also tend to focus on market distortion. And I think less focus has been done on the value that is brought about through housing stability, right? The ways in which through rent stabilization, things like being able to keep your kids in the same school for more than a year, right? Or maintaining social support networks that help you to avoid poverty, help you to avoid, falling down and out when you have an emergency, which all families have, right? That is a lot more of the more recent research is starting to look at that. And is starting to really give a more holistic picture of the sort of overall positive impacts of rent stabilization policies, which is that they reduce inequality, they provide a source of stability, et cetera, which in some ways, it's up for debate, obviously, but it can help compensate for loss in market efficiency in some ways. And so now I want to just, again, highlight briefly the sort of economic benefits of housing stability. And so rent stabilization ensures households are less housing cost burden by limiting their rent increases, right? So across the board, if renters are paying only what they could afford on rent, right? So they're only paying up to that 30% of their household income, they would have an extra $124 billion to spend in the community each year, or about $6,200 per household. So this would cover the basics for a 3-person household, like 90% of an entire food budget, 63% of the cost of childcare, 66% of the cost of tuition at a public 4-year university. And then just in general, right, everyone is better off. You start to see these racial inequities shrink once people are just paying what they can afford towards their housing costs. So across the board, right, but markedly in the communities that are most impacted by poverty and housing instability, you see these huge increases in their disposable income. So now I'm going to talk about that and what that looks like for St. Paul in particular, right? And so if people in St. Paul were only paying what they could afford towards their rent, the total disposable income for renters across the board would have been $151,994, $899 million larger if renters paid only what they could afford on housing. So that's almost $152 million larger in terms of disposable income. This means renters are paying rent on time, right? Plus spending disposable income and stimulating the economy. This means renters are saving down payments, become eventual homeowners. There is less homelessness. There is less of your time and money in eviction court, less government time and money on all the services used to deal with homelessness if people are paying what they could afford on their rent. What that looks like across race. And so the average disposable income for renter households overall would have been, when you break down that big, large number that I just named, would have been about $5,374 on average with no rent burden. And so with no rent burden, the average disposable income for Black renters with earnings at all income levels would have increased from $4,814 in 2000 to $5,033 in 2019. And with no rent burden, the average disposable income for white renters with earnings at all income levels would have increased from $4,938 in 2000 and to $5,755 in 2019, right? So again, this benefits everyone, right? It's not, although again, we know that the people most impacted, disproportionately impacted are folks who are racialized. This benefits everyone across the board when folks are paying only what they can afford or paying what they can afford towards their housing costs. And then the economic benefits across the board in St. Paul of people only paying the rent that's affordable to them. With no rent burden, the average disposable income for all renters with all income earnings is $5,374. So again, just breaking down that big $1 million number to talk about what is the benefit to households in general if they're not spending too much on their towards their rent. So again, if renters paid only what they could afford, everyone benefits. Everyone is better off. We see racial inequity start to shrink, and that disposable income could instead go towards stimulating the economy, towards all the other things that that a city needs to function, instead of towards homelessness costs, towards mental health services, towards all the things that families need to access if they've been evicted or displaced. And then there's environmental benefits of housing stability. So rent control reduces housing costs, granting households the ability to live often in transit-rich urban centers, reducing the need to drive. And so, I didn't go too deeply into what the sort of landscape looks like for St. Paul, but just in general, we do have this data on the National Equity Atlas. In 2019, we found that workers living at or below 200% poverty had the longest average commute time by all modes among all income groups. And so just an average time of about 26 minutes to commute to work. I'm sorry, let me just get this data point correctly. So in 2019, workers living at or below 200% of poverty had the longest average commute time by all modes among all income groups. At the same time, white households were most likely to have access to a car, while Black households were most likely to not have access to a car. And we have some stats for those numbers too. So again, environmental benefits of housing stability include just shorter commute times, people having greater access to jobs and to transit and things like that. And then health benefits of housing stability. These are more generalized. These are not specific to St. Paul. But again, just noting that rent control and stabilization policies require often these sort of proactive code inspections, which can result in improved housing conditions and improved housing stock in general, right? So safe housing conditions where stably housed residents are 20% less likely to experience housing problems and be exposed to hazardous conditions. Versus, right, like in San Mateo Valley, where 75% of displaced households ended up in worse housing situations because they had no other choice and were forced to live in cramped conditions, homes with asbestos, lead, mold, and bug infestation leading to illness. Right, and just again, what we know, right, like when folks are forced to move from the housing that they're in, typically the housing that they're in is the best housing for them. When they're forced to move, they are often moving to worse conditions, particularly if they've been evicted. If folks have been evicted, they now have a record, and that record prevents them from being able to access housing into the future for the rest of their lives in some places, right? Where places where there's not any mechanisms to expunge a record after a certain time period, or where the case, the tenant actually did pay off or work out an agreement, whatever the case may be, that record still lives. And so when folks have eviction records, when folks are displaced from housing, when folks can't afford housing and have to move, they are often moving into worse places than where they were. And so also, right, regular access to health services, again, when people are only paying what they can afford on rent, translates into people are more healthy. People are 23% more likely to access health services when they're not having to decide between, do I pay the rent this month? Do I take care of my health? Do I buy food this week? Whatever the case may be, families are able to make better decisions about their health and their medical circumstances. Whereas versus displaced households are more likely to visit the ER, more likely to be hospitalized, more likely to have mental health related visits. And then lastly, the community benefits of housing stability. So again, if long-term tenants have, access to these things, they can form social clubs, neighborhood institutions that make communities better. This means sustain voter blocks to pass initiatives, leverage resources, elect the representatives that are going to represent the community. And then long-term housing stability fosters a sense of identity and culture, which is important to supporting local businesses, supporting, folks who are newly settled into the community, establishing homes outside of the house, a community, shared memories, familiarity. And so again, just to re-emphasize the point, rent stabilization, right, it's so often so much framed as a tool for addressing the cost of housing, but it's less framed as a stabilization tool. It's less framed as something that can help people who are continuously pushed out of their neighborhoods or have to move from neighborhood to neighborhood due to economic forces that are just really in a lot of situations beyond their control. And so just want to emphasize, right, that proximity to one's job, proximity to schools, the stability it provides to children to be able to get their education, to not be displaced, to not become humans in the future who, right, have trauma and who are still stuck in these sort of poverty cycles. These sort of tools are important. And so that is it. I thank you all. Appreciate your time. And you should have a copy of this PowerPoint, but again, a lot of the resources, all the maps that I talked about are available in the National Equity Atlas website, and I can paste the link in a moment.
Great. Thank you so much, Rashida, for all the information you just gone through with us. I've seen 3 people wanting to speak. There's a 4th. So we'll go through them in the order that they've popped up. The first, Jessica's question was just, can you share the slides with us by email so that we can get them out to the task force?
Yes, I did share them. So you should have them, but if there's an issue, just email me and I'll send them back out.
Great, thank you. Kyrie.
Thanks, Philip. And thank you for coming and speaking with us today, Rashida. I enjoyed the presentation. I wanted to dig into the slides where you talked about the cost-effective nature of rent control on a couple fronts. St. Paul doesn't currently have proactive code inspections. We don't have a rental registry, but the current ordinance does have features that are likely to make property owners seek more exceptions, which would lead to more staffing costs. So I wanted to ask 2 questions in that nature. First, how do you think about the benefits of rent control without those features that you mentioned that are in many cities? So once again, the rental registry, proactive inspections, how do you think about those benefits? And then second, how do you think about the rent savings that residents would achieve from rent control versus the additional cost of bureaucracy that could be passed on to them with a robust bureaucracy and inspection regime.
Yeah, thank you for those questions. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense around the question around rental registries and proactive code enforcement. I'll say I still think it's worthy to explore a rent stabilization policy and to have one, even if you don't have those other protections. But obviously, those other protections make those policies more effective. But I would say even when in places that don't have, and you have to be careful, right? Because these rental registries and these things can also be abused, can also not be effective. And so, right, if you have a policy paired with these things and are not effective, they actually become more like loopholes for people. Just to give you a little flavor from the Philly standpoint, right? In Philly, we do not have a proactive code inspection, but we do have L&I inspectors, and they're complaint-based inspections. Significant issues with that process in terms of just capacity issues, what the inspectors are looking at, what gets counted as part of the code, just lots of issues there. But it helps, right? It helps tenants in terms of just having some rights, and the body that enforces them. Also, there's a mechanism where tenants can make complaints and have a hearing, right? So it just needs to be layered and has to be effective in order to really, be paired well with some of these other policies. And I think you said rental registry. What was the other protection you talked about?
So you talked about the savings from a rent control regime to actual residents. If you had additional, whether it's through property taxes or through passing through the rental registry expenses that a landlord could have, if those expenses were passed on to landlords, have you folks done any analysis, or how do you think about the cost benefit of you're saving in rent, but you're having these additional expenses that you're going to receive because of a rent control regime?
Yeah, that's a great question. I believe some studies have been done about that specifically. I have not myself looked at that analysis, but I can definitely share some information about that. But just generally speaking, again, just based on what we have looked at in terms of what tenants benefit from when they save money on rent, or when they're paying what they can afford, the benefits just are there, right? Like they get built into it. And ultimately, right, where we see situations where tenants are paying almost 50% in most cases, when you look at different places around the country, they're paying about 50% of their income towards, so even a reduction of just like 10% of that, like think about that, like think about how much more money you have. And so even if the landlords are passing on some of those costs, right, and you have a rent stabilization policy where it's capped, I still think there's a benefit that comes out of it for the tenants, even if they are paying a little bit more towards costs that are passed down. The fact that they are not paying 50% of their income or 40%, right, it balances out, I think. But I will share some studies that look into that in much more depth and can speak much more intelligently to it than I can.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rashida. So we have 3 other hands up. I think we can get through them. We want to take our break at 5 minutes to 2. So if the question askers can be quick and Rashida kind of quick in the responses, we'll try to get through all 3 before our break. Next up is B.
Thanks, Philip. Hi, Rashida. Thank you so much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. I'm curious, as I'm a renter myself, and I'm just kind of seeing not only the price of my housing possibly going up with all the construction that's going on around me, but I'm also seeing the price of gas going up, and I'm also seeing the price of my groceries going up and the price of my healthcare going up. I'm a first generation renter as well, who went to school, and I'm also paying for that with little to no assistance. And I'm curious as to, I have like a very dark thought process as to what will happen if we don't address the issue of the housing crisis now. But I'm curious, as someone who works in this policy work and has more of that like data analysis lens to it, what do you see happening if we don't address this housing crisis now, and if we don't address it with the policies that we're trying to pass, or at least if we don't address it in a way that is trying to keep people in their homes? Like, what do you see happening within the next 5 years?
Yeah, quick answer, just more entrenched poverty, more entrenched. We're just going to continue to dig into the circumstance that it's just going to get deeper. And so often people are talking about the housing crisis as if it is inevitable, as if it is, we use these metaphors, tsunami. It is by design. And like, we have the opportunity to design it differently right now. I think with the infusion of emergency rental assistance money, ARPA, folks are really leveraging this to address this crisis now. Like, folks are recognizing that the pandemic deepened what was already an existing crisis, and we're just continuing up this road. And so just in short answer, it's just going to get, excuse my expression, shit is going to hit the fan even harder than it already has. And the people who are already the most disproportionately impacted are just going to continue to be in those positions. And so just quick example, what we saw in Philly is that the people most impacted by COVID-19 are the same people who face eviction, are the same people who face the highest poverty rates, same exact people who are facing highest rates of violence, highest rates of bad health, right? These are all the same people. And so like, if we don't want to see a whole millions of people disappear and die, right? Because that is what is at stake here. It's life or death in these circumstances. It's just going to be more of the same and worse. So hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Rashida. Next up is Arlene. You are muted.
Yeah, thank you, Rashida, for that presentation. I really enjoyed it. It was quite informative. I have a couple of things. You mentioned early on, it was very striking to me, the shrinking zip codes. And, and I was thinking about job opportunities. And you even mentioned later on that they have greater access to jobs, particularly in the metropolitan area, where the kinds of jobs that I would think there would be more job opportunities. So these shrinking zip codes are worrisome in that, if there are no places for them to live, how hard it is for them to get to jobs. I know I was working at the Dorothy Day shelter once, and I was talking to a guy who was working in St. Paul, but when I asked him where he lived, he said, well, he lived out in one of the suburbs, and he is actually renting or sharing a place with a guy out in one of the suburbs, and then had to be had to catch a ride into the city with him so that he could work at his job. He would have lunch over there. I mean, so this is the kind of thing that the jobs are maybe in the city, but if you've got these shrinking zip codes, that people don't have access to housing that's near where they work. And then a question that I have is that you mentioned a comment about that one of the benefits of a tailored rent stabilization policy that it's easier and cheaper to build housing. And I wondered if you could elaborate on that and maybe elaborate on the other as well.
Sure, yeah. And I may have missed some words, but what I was saying is that if you are going to have a rent stabilization policy, you have to explore making it cheaper and easier to build. Because of some of the concerns that rent control policy constrains supply. I was just suggesting that if you're going to have it, you need to be looking at also zoning policies, regulatory policies that make it more difficult to build new affordable housing, and just sort of try to pinpoint where the actual issues are. And often in a lot of cities, it's actually the exclusionary zoning policies. It's actually the regulatory procedures that make it harder to build, and not necessarily rent control or rent stabilization as the culprit. So that was just my suggestion, to kind of make sure that you're considering that alongside of implementing your rent stabilization policy.
Great, thank you. And last question from Catherine.
Yeah, thank you. That was awesome, if not very depressing in some ways. But, it really gives us all a very clear perception of what's happening, not just, to society in whole. I think, one of the things we're having problems with in this group, again, there's this split with the whole idea of that rent stabilization actually would negatively affect the supply of affordable housing. And so I really liked how you said it's not an either or, but it's a both and this is a tool right now to keep people. Wondering also about this idea of having new construction exemption. I think the mayor was talking.
I don't know if it's just me or she froze.
She froze for me as well. So maybe go with what you heard as she was starting her question, unless she comes right back here.
Yeah, it was more, she was commenting and then was about to get to the question. So not quite sure what the question was, but.
It sounded like she was starting to say, what do you think about a new construction exemption?
I did just send her a message to let her know that she's freezing, so hopefully she'll hop back on.
Yeah, it looked like she might have hopped off and will probably hop back on. So I guess we could just wait for her question.
But maybe because of Philip's point, just the new construction exemption, have you thought about or worked with any cities that have that policy in place, or how do you see that tying into a rent stabilization program?
Yeah, no, so I have not worked with cities that have that exemption yet. So don't have a ton of thoughts about it. But again, I just think if you're thinking about that, right, as your policy feature, it just needs to be paired with other protections and other things that allow developers to still be able to build and to still be able to do what they need to do. And I think, again, so much of the culprit tends to be actually exclusionary zoning policies. And so just like thinking about this more holistically and not siloing out, that would be my only thought about it, is like, don't silo this discussion out from the rest of the discussions around housing issues and planning and development, because they're all interconnected. And, that's so often these policies are created in the vacuum without considering some of those other things. And so I just think like this advisory group is great that you all are tussling with some of these issues and bringing in additional information that can help you build a holistic policy that's actually going to work for your city. And I can't, I haven't gone into deep detail around your policy to set, give a informed opinion about whether this makes sense for your city. Obviously, you all came up with it, and this is, it felt right for you all. But yeah, I just think that they can't be done in a vacuum. They have to be done in consideration of the holistic picture of what's happening.
Thank you so much, Rashida. I don't see Catherine having come back on, so I think we are going to go ahead and move into our break. But can folks give a round of applause directly, virtually, some way? Thank you so much, Rashida, for sharing your expertise with us today. And we are looking forward to our next invited guest expert coming up in about 5 minutes. So we'll start in again at 2 minutes past 2.
Thank you for having me. Take care, everybody.
Hello, everybody. This is Sarah. I'm the next speaker. And for those of you that are just hanging out, I'm going to test my presentation to make sure I can get it up on the screen. So bear with me while I do that, if you would.
Sounds great.
Sarah, this is Tripti. I'm just going to make sure I get you on co-host and that you have typical controls.
It would be really
You should have access now.
Okay, let me give this a shot. Are you able to see my screen?
Almost, as it says, it's you started screen sharing. Okay, we see your screen.
And now I'm trying to get it into presentation mode. Are you still seeing
it? We see your presentation slide. Yep.
Oh, let's see if we can get it to work when everybody rejoins too, shall we?
And then I will.
You could just leave it up if you want.
Can I? Oh, that's even better.
Sure. Yep.
Eliminate issues. What were you saying?
Sarah,
go ahead.
I was just going to say that you're a spotlight speaker. So whenever you're talking, the view will be on you. And I might try to pin you actually, if that's okay.
Not sure I need that pressure.
All right, we won't do that then.
Thank you.
Philip, I think we're good to go here. So I'm just going to run for a short break myself, and then, but I think it looks like we're ready to roll. So
awesome. Thank you, Tripti. Okay, welcome back, everybody. We are now going to transition into our second presentation and welcome Sarah Harris to present to us. Sarah is the Executive Vice President of Strategy, Partnerships, and Production at Aon. Prior to that, she was the Managing Director of the University of Minnesota's Foundation, their real estate advisors group, and has served on the boards of numerous charitable and art organizations here in the Twin Cities, as well as serving as board chair of the Minneapolis Parks Foundation. So we are so grateful that also on very short notice, Sarah, you were able to join us and are really looking forward to learning from your expertise. We'll accumulate a queue of questions or comments as you're going, and then try to get to those in the last 10 minutes or so of our hour with you here at the task force. And again, thank you so much for being here, and we'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. I hope you can all hear me. Yes, thumbs up. Okay. First of all, I want to thank you for inviting me to be here. As was mentioned, this was done on very short notice, only a few days, and many of the very smart people in this virtual room helped to provide content. But because it was short notice, this is a little bit of a Frankenstein presentation. So you're all just going to have to keep your sense of humor as we muddle our way through it together. And I would also note that many of you in this virtual room have a lot of expertise in this topic. And so to the extent I'm not making a point you think is important, or I'm underselling something, whatever, feel free to just jump in or reserve comments to the end, however that works. Lastly, I would just say I'm really sorry I wasn't able to join for the first presentation. It sounds like it was incredibly interesting, but equally important, I don't know what was or wasn't said. And so I may be going over some of the same information. And so for that, I apologize if you've already heard it, but maybe if you hear it twice, you know it's equally important. So with that, let's get going. If I do my job well today, I'm hoping that you will take away from this presentation the different kinds of housing that are possible, the metrics of how our region is currently performing, the economics of how housing works, and importantly, why does it matter and what can we be doing better in our region? And before we start, I'm going to go through just a couple of overarching definitions because we are kind of an acronym and term heavy industry, and you probably went through a lot of this in the last presentation, but I'm going to go through it again anyhow. The first one is AMI, that's the area median income. And as of last month, HUD published the income for the Minneapolis-St. Paul area of $118,000 and change, which would be the median income for everybody in this area. That number went up 12.7% from last year because it's based on 2019 data, which is the most current data that HUD had available. The cautionary note is next year at this time, we expect that that median income will actually go down because they will be basing it on data from 2020 when there was a pretty significant amount of income loss in the COVID era. So just be aware of that. Next would be NOAA, naturally occurring affordable housing. This is the older housing in our community. It's pretty much everywhere. It was built in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, et cetera. It is older, less amenity, probably not in the greatest of condition, but by virtue of the fact that it's been around for a while, the rents have remained lower. And this housing tends to serve people in our community that are at or below the 60th percentile in median income. And if my machine would work, there we go. Next would be restricted affordable housing. This housing looks a lot like NOAA in many cases, but by virtue of the fact that there are agreements in place that restrict the level of rent, whether it's Section 8 vouchers, low-income housing tax credits, many other programs that keep rents at an affordable level, this is not NOAA yet. When those agreements expire, and they all do at some point in time, these properties become NOAA, and then they too are susceptible to being acquired and lost. Workforce housing is also older housing, maybe not as old as the NOAA in many cases. This is the housing that is serving people in our community who are earning at that 80% level or above. And I've listed there what the incomes would translate to. So if you're earning $94,000 and change, you're in the 80 percentile. And if you're earning 141,000, you're in that 120 percentile. And all of these folks would be considered workforce. I find that a little ironic, of course, because we spent the last 2 years talking about essential workers, many of whom are well below the 60% median income. But nonetheless, we refer to workforce housing as this higher tier of affordability. Affordable housing, largely speaking, is housing that serves people earning at that 60 percentile or less income. And folks who are cost burdened, I think I heard that phrase as I joined on in the last presentation, are people who are spending more than 30% of their income on housing. And this is a measure that is used when people are qualifying for mortgages as well. It also holds true with rent. If you are spending more than 30% on your housing costs, you are burdened by that housing cost. And interestingly enough, the Greater Minnesota Housing Fund did a study and found that more than half of people living in NOAA properties are cost burdened. In fact, many of them, again, more than half, are paying more than 50% of their income on housing. And that matters because we have a lot of upscale investors, whether they are local or national, who are seeking to buy these NOAA properties. They quickly renovate them, and then they increase the rents. And that matters because what we are finding is that it self-evicts. All of these folks that are living in NOAA buildings, if they are cost burdened already, they cannot afford the additional rent when it is increased, and therefore they choose to vacate because they cannot afford to live there anymore. That's called self-eviction. And that displaces these folks into our community, which has ripple effects throughout our community. And I'll speak to that in a little bit.
Sarah, sorry to interrupt, but there's just a couple of questions in the comment, maybe the easiest to address now rather than waiting to the end, related to the definition of AMI. Is that based on a particular household size, the numbers that you're using?
It is, and my colleagues on the phone can help with this, but it is based on if it's an individual earning that income, that is their area median income. And I believe that 118,000 is based on a family of 4 in our community.
Great, thank you very much.
And others on the phone who have been in this longer can certainly correct me. I am happy to be corrected. All right. Continuing on, were there other questions too, or was that the one?
No, different versions of the same question.
Okay, perfect. Because I don't see the chat right now, so it's helpful that you're jumping in for me. So why are we here today and why does it matter? Many of our neighbors in this community are currently cost burdened and they are struggling to find places to live. And as I mentioned before, the essential workers and first responders that we've been talking about for 2 years, if they can't afford to live in our community, how will our community continue to function? And our employee base is part of the equation. Study after study is tying the success of our region to the stability of housing. We need to have an affordable place to live in order for our region to be vibrant, growing, and equitable. And I've just listed here some data points from all these different studies that are out there about stable housing leads to downstream solutions. Emergency room visits reduce, healthcare costs reduce, nomadic households increase the demand on public services and the costs associated with those services. Homeless people with criminal records are twice as likely to reoffend as opposed to their counterparts who secure housing. Home prices in our area since 2008 have increased over 3 times faster than incomes have. And that's important because the occupations that are adding the most jobs in the next 10 years, including things like personal care aides, nursing assistants, et cetera, 70% of those provide a median wage that is lower than what's required to afford housing. And that connects back to employers. 58% of large companies who lack nearby affordable housing options report that their employees are citing their commute times as reasons why they are leaving the company. And in a time of labor shortage, we should be connecting the dots on that. And my last point there is that children with housing instability are more likely to repeat a grade. So as we're thinking about all of these downstream investments that we as a region are making in improving the conditions for our region, we should be thinking about housing as the upstream stabilizer. It's the efficient, effective, and just way of addressing these downstream issues. And the justice part is equally important. It's the right thing to do, and it's long overdue. At the tail end of the last presentation, I heard the discussion about the injustices that have always been a problem. And certainly the folks that have always experienced these issues, their issues are being magnified by COVID, by the killings of George Floyd and Daunte Wright. The traumas that have come into the spotlight in the last 2 years have always been present for a large part of our community. And as our community, really the nation, focuses on these issues, we also have to be thinking about the exponentially increasing costs of addressing these issues. And if we don't look at interventions upstream, we will not move the needle downstream. I like to say that housing is a fundamental need. There's air, there's water, there's food, and then there's shelter, in that order. And yet housing is much harder for our diverse communities to access. As noted on this slide, women and people of color have great pay inequities, which means they are spending a much greater percentage of their income on housing. 72% of students that are facing homelessness are in communities of color. And if you recall from the last slide, they're more likely to repeat a grade once they're into that system of homelessness. A disproportionate number of the units the NOAA units that we are losing were sold in moderate income and racially diverse neighborhoods. And this matters because if you look at the last bullet on this slide, Minnesota is one of the worst when it comes to leveling the playing field between white and Black residents. Between 2004 and 2014, we had the 7th fastest growth of people of color in the US. And it's predicted that by 2040, people of color are going to be the majority in 4 of our counties, including Hennepin and Ramsey County. So we not only can do better, we must do better. The regional health depends on it. So now I'm going to kind of show how our region is doing in metrics to give you a sense of how our housing story plays out. To start with, as a region, we have a lot of great assets and amenities. We have 3 million people living here. We have great park systems. We have a lot of Fortune 500 companies, great colleges and universities, a really vibrant art and music scene, and we could add more assets to this slide as well, but we stop there just to keep the conversation going. Those assets mean that as our region has grown faster than the national average, whether measured by population, jobs, median household income, what have you. So far a great story, right? But here's the cautionary tale. We have not been building housing on a per capita basis at the same rate as other major metropolitan regions. We are falling behind in our housing supply. There are a lot of reasons for that, one of which is during the Great Recession, the money dried up, so development dried up. And that means investors stopped investing in housing and it made it difficult to build housing. We need about 5,000 units a year in order to keep up with demand. And during the recession, during 4 years, we only delivered about 1,500 units a year. And that supply shortage is being exacerbated by the affordable housing crisis. And that's the chart on the right. No matter what geographic area you look at, we did not deliver enough affordable housing. Less than half in all but one case. And even in the case of the urban areas, we only delivered 51% of the affordable housing that was needed in our community. Let's take a little closer look at what that means on an affordable housing. From 2013 to 2020, we lost 52,000 units of NOAA housing to upscale investors. During that same time, we were only building just under 8,000 units, which means we had a net loss of affordable units of 44,000 units in less than 10 years. That was an average annual loss of 6,300 units. And sadly, that loss is continuing to this day. Every year we are losing affordability in our community. And you can see in the picture on the right, we have NOAA units scattered throughout the state. This is not a metro issue. This is a statewide issue. Of course, there is a large concentration of NOAA units in the metro area, as you can see in the call out box. And what does that mean? Well, we have increased demand at the very time that we have the lowest rental vacancy rate of any metro market in the US. For the folks that are our lowest income earners, that 30% AMI level, we have a 0% vacancy rate. And I'm going to show you a pretty stark statistic here shortly on that. Additionally, we have less than 2% vacancy in our Class C apartments, which are largely NOAA buildings. That means they are effectively full. That 2% rate means that once somebody leaves, it takes a month to turn over and get somebody new in. That's your 2% rate. So we're effectively full. And that demand coupled with the barriers to building new supply makes the NOAA properties even more susceptible to upscale conversions from those investors that I've spoken to. A healthy housing supply should grow, the rent should grow in line with inflation, and a rental growth rate. In addition to that, to having that rental growth rate, we need to have market vacancy that's 5% or more. We aren't even close to that. We are so far below that vacancy rate. So here's some big picture metrics for you. I mentioned that 30% AMI rental units, that we have a 0% vacancy rate. Well, here's what that vacancy rate looks like. It's really less than 0%. We need 170,000 units to serve these low income earners. We only have under 65,000 units. That means we have a 105,000 unit gap to serve these folks. Right now, by way of example, the Minneapolis Public Housing Authority has a waiting list of 17,000 households for their public housing serving these 30% units. At the same time, during the period from 2000 to 2019, renter income increased 1%, while gross rents increased 14%, which means we are driving more and more renters into needing those lowest tiers of affordable housing. And sadly, the folks that are cost burdened in our community skew very heavily towards our Black neighbors. Whites are less likely to be cost burdened. So the equity gap is also growing. And to put a fine point on that, whites are the most likely to be homeowners. Every single community of color is more likely to be renting than to be owning. And I just bring us back to the stat that I said before, and that is for all the occupations that we will be adding the most in the next 10 years, which includes the essential workers that we need most, 70% of them will have wages that do not help them to afford housing. So let's move into what does that mean for our region? First, just a couple of quick facts. It costs about $300,000, probably more given the way construction pricing is going, but let's just say $300,000 to build a new unit of housing, whether it's market rate or affordable, it's the same cost. To acquire and rehab NOAA units, it's about half that, or $150,000. It takes 2 to 4 years to build a new unit of housing. It takes 3 to 5 years to build new affordable housing. It takes longer because the funding cycles are just that much more complicated and competitive. And yet we are losing NOAA properties. It only takes about 3 months for those buildings to be acquired and lost. In Ramsey County, it was stated that 37,000 families live at or below that 30% AMI level, and they need 15,000 new units of affordable housing. Well, if you take 15,000 units times $300,000 to build each unit, that's $4.5 billion right now that we need to serve Ramsey County's need. And the county recently announced a $74 million funding pool. That's a lot of money, but not even a drop in the bucket relative to the need. And that doesn't even account for the ongoing and increasing demand. You can see the chart on the right. Maybe you can see it, it's kind of teeny. But it shows that the city of St. Paul has had an increasing population every year since 2010. So the need now and the losses we are experiencing do not even account for the fact that our demand is growing because our population has been growing. So that's Ramsey County. Let's take that and extrapolate it over the entire metro region. Well, we have a shortage of 45,000 affordable homes today. At $300,000, that's $13.5 billion needed right now to put those units in place. We need 5,000 homes every year just to account for our population growth. 5,000 new units at 300,000 would be $1.5 billion per year. And that's not even accounting for the losses of NOAA. That's 6,300 unit per year loss. That's another $1.9 billion if we were to build our way out of those units that we are losing. If we were to preserve them, it's still $1 billion to try and keep those units affordable. So when you start looking at numbers of this magnitude, you realize that there's not political will, and importantly, there aren't public funds available to pull us out of this housing shortage. We are needing and will always need private capital to help solve this issue. Let me just go through a couple of quick things. I've mentioned before the costs to build 300,000, about half that to buy and rehab the NOAA properties. There is significant pressure on that capital. To build a new unit, that $300,000 may be impossible to entice to the table to get the private investors because of the regulatory impacts on the yield. And I'll talk more about that shortly. It costs more to build than to preserve the NOAA units. But even when we are buying NOAA units, we are competing with the market and paying the higher market price to buy, whilst we are going to keep the rents low, which will create a gap. And there is no current funding source of magnitude or speed that will cover that gap. And building the new restricted affordable housing is dependent on very constrained sources of funding. Right now, about 1 application out of every 10 viable applications gets funded. The timing is also very different. I mentioned before, 2 to 3, maybe 4 years to build a new unit market. 60 to 90 days, we lose NOAA, and 3 to 5 years to build the new restricted affordable housing. The bottom line here is that we need private capital to build new, and investors have options of where they can go. NOAA units are half the cost. We can deliver more volume if we preserve it, but it's very urgent and we don't have the funds to manage this program. New restricted affordable housing is great, but it's highly competitive and it takes a long time to deliver. I just want to put a face on what's happening with these NOAA losses. In 2015, there was a project at Crossroads at Penn, 698 units, so 698 families in Richfield that lost their homes in about 2 months because the property was sold, it was quickly upscaled, and we displaced all 798 families into the community. Suddenly the schools were looking around saying, hey, wait a second, where did our students go? The local workforce was scattered. And then the city and the county needed to step in and start restabilizing these families with different supports. And the local economy was also impacted as well when the workforce became very unstable. So we lost those units. That was a call of action for Aon in particular. We started working with Bloomington, Richfield, Brooklyn Park, and other cities when properties became available, and we stepped in to buy them. We bought Seasons Park with 422 units. In Richfield, we bought Minneapolis 220, which was a scattered site portfolio in Minneapolis, 220 units. We bought Blooming Meadows, which was called Village Club at the time in Bloomington. We bought Huntington Place in Brooklyn Park. We bought Cobblestone in Maplewood. That was nearly 2,000 families that we kept from being displaced. That's about 5,000 residents. And if you look at that on a city population basis, that's about mid-range city size in this Twin Cities region. In fact, the resident population at Huntington Place is equivalent to the size of the city of Osseo. And we were trying to keep these folks from being displaced. So we saved the properties, but it wasn't without angst. It came with $100 million gap, some of which we solved at closing, some of which we are still trying to solve for, and it remains in question whether we will be able to find those funds. We bought the properties before we had them fully funded, and I'm sure many of you are saying, well, why the heck would you do that? Well, quite simply, if we didn't, 2,000 families would be looking for shelter in a completely full market, and that would have rippled through our entire economy and our school systems and every other part of our community. Sure, we could build them new homes, but over what amount of time while these folks are displaced? And if we're building at $300,000 a unit, that's a $630 million issue. So what money would we have used to do that? Suddenly our $100 million gap is looking like a pretty good bargain. Okay, so now I'm going to jump into the housing ecosystem. I've talked about these types of properties already. We have the new housing that really starts at that 80% AMI and goes up from there. It's funded privately and the rents are at market. As that housing becomes older, it becomes workforce housing, 10 to 25-year-old buildings. And now we're serving the maybe 60, probably closer to 80 to 120% AMI market of renters. Again, funded privately. The rents are set by the market. And as those properties become older, they become NOAA properties. 75% of the Twin Cities affordable housing are NOAA properties. They are unregulated, unrestricted. They tend to be the older properties, 25 or more years old, and they are serving the 30 to 60% AMI residents. The funding is private, and I put a plus there because as we are starting to acquire these properties, we are going to need to seek public sources to fund gaps. And the rents are market. However, again, as we're starting to preserve these properties, we should start to think about putting them into restricted agreements. 90% of the housing market is in these three different categories: new, workforce, and NOAA properties. And it's important to note that the new housing we build today becomes the workforce housing for tomorrow, which becomes the NOAA housing thereafter. And if we aren't focusing on every piece of this flow of housing, our crisis will continue to grow. On the right, you can see I've also listed the restricted affordable housing. That represents about 25% of the affordable housing stock in our community. Those properties are in the new to 15-year-old range. They too are serving the 30 to 60% renters. And in many cases, they have targeted populations, whether it's people with disabilities, long-term homeless, seniors, and other populations that are targeted for affordable housing. These projects are publicly funded in many cases, and they have income restrictions. And as I mentioned before, once their agreements expire, these properties become NOAA and are susceptible to investors acquiring them. So let's talk about how we can increase housing and the fundamentals of the economics behind housing. To start with, market rate housing, about 80% of the cost to build is the construction, about 10% is land cost, and about 10% is the soft cost, like professional fees, city fees, and developer fees. The construction costs are volatile and rising faster than inflation, even in today's inflationary environment, which, by the way, is in part driven by construction costs. Developer fees are necessary to cover the front end risk that is entirely borne by the developer, and it helps to ensure that the developer is going to be stable enough to complete the project. So really the only levers we have to try and bring costs in line with what can be underwritten by the investors and the lenders are the costs that are driven by policy in the public sector, as well as the land costs if the sellers are willing to negotiate. From a NOAA standpoint, this is a little bit of an eye chart, but on in the column, you can see what an upscale investor looks at to buy a NOAA property. And then on the right column, you can see what it takes to preserve the property. Well, it's more expensive to preserve. We have to pay the same amount that the upscale investor is paying for the property, but our costs to renovate and the transaction costs for the preservation of NOAA are more than an upscale investor pays. Why is that? Well, because our renovation is usually looking at a longer period of time, and our renovation and our transaction fees oftentimes are more expensive because the sources of funds that we are seeking to fill the gap come with additional restrictions and requirements that makes it more expensive for us to do the construction and have more compliance requirements and ongoing operating requirements that the private market upscale investor does not have. And because we are going to keep the rents affordable, as you can see here, less than half of what an upscale investor could get for the same unit, it means that we aren't able to underwrite the same amount of debt, the same amount of equity that an upscale investor can bring to the project. The last thing that I would note here is that last line, resident supports. You know, as I came into the last presentation, there was a discussion about the folks who have always been traumatized, lowest incomes, traumatized by domestic violence and racial injustices and other things are the very people that then experienced even greater trauma through COVID. Well, folks that are cost burdened, which, as I mentioned before, many people in the NOAA properties are experiencing all kinds of pressures in their life, and they're traumatized by all of these different issues that are happening in the world. So it takes additional work, it takes additional resource to help stabilize folks and keep them living in their units. The kind of stabilization that is needed doesn't have additional funding available to it. And even for the small percentage of folks for whom service supports are available, those supports are not provided for the long term. We can often only receive those dollars on an annual basis, which makes our work less efficient and the success of our residents much less certain. So now let's look at how the money flows into these projects. On new build for market housing, it's different in that it's largely covered through debt and equity. There aren't as many soft sources needed, and there certainly isn't a gap driven by the fact that the rents are kept much lower. This is an example that Tony provided for Tony Bronco, who's on the phone somewhere, I can't see him. Provided for the Harper Apartments in St. Paul. 65% of that project was lent by Associated Bank. Just over 33% was equity provided by the state retirement system. And then Ryan Companies also provided equity as the developer. Now for market housing, local banks are very risk adverse. They will not close until all risk is gone. Fund investors are willing to look at more risk provided they are getting a risk-adjusted return as a result. And they won't close until they are certain that all approvals through the public sector are received, so all of the entitlements are in place. And they also need to understand and make sure that the project cost is committed. The developer takes all of the front end risk, as I mentioned before, which requires them to be really smart about locating and designing a project that is going to attract capital. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense for them to lean into taking that risk. And that means they cannot always respond to what communities want, because the project may not happen if the community wants something that makes the investment risk too much to bring capital to the table. And how do investors look at assessing these opportunities to invest or not? They really look at a variety of things. Three big ones are an appraisal, an income approach appraisal, which I'll get to and I'll explain shortly. They'll look at a debt service coverage ratio, and they will look at the yield. And all three of these metrics are dependent upon what we call the net operating income. That is nothing more than a way to calculate how much income is left after all of the expenses for the property have been paid. So it stands to reason that the more cash flow you have, or the higher the net operating income, it's always going to be best. So let's look at the first of those approaches. I don't know if any of you loved your 10th grade math class, but when I got this slide, it brought back all of those memories of my 10th grade math books. Simply stated, the income approach valuation is an approach we use on multifamily housing. Effectively, what we're saying is let's look at the net operating income, or the amount of income, as a percentage of the value. So riskier properties will demand a higher net operating income. In other words, investors demand more rent return for their riskier investments. This percentage that we use is called a cap rate, or a capitalization rate. And higher cap rates mean higher risk, because a higher cap rate means you will be getting more net income to support the value of that property. I feel like as a teacher in 10th grade math, I should be saying, are there any questions about that? Pop your hand up if that hasn't been explained. Okay, so riskier properties need more income to support taking the risk. The next thing that we look at is the cash flow and the debt service coverage ratio. So what we're really saying here is there going to be enough cash flow left over to cover the debt payments? I mean, go figure. Lenders want to make sure they are going to get paid. So this is a way to say there needs to be more cash flow than just what's needed to pay the loan. So typically lenders want a debt service cash ratio of 1.2, or another way of saying that is the property needs to have 20% more cash flow than what is needed to pay the debt service. In some cases, in affordable housing, a ratio can be 1.15, meaning 15% more cash flow needed than what will be required to pay the debt service. In other words, if you're getting less than what that cash flow ratio is telling you, it means that there's absolutely no margin for error. If the rents go down, or if expenses increase, or both, then there's not going to be enough money to pay the debt service. Again, class, any questions? All right. And the last of the three that investors will look at is called yield. This is the third measure, and it's just simply a function of how much income is there relative to the costs. The higher a yield, that means it's more attractive to investors because it means there's more cash flow to pay returns. A market rate project is going to have a 6% or higher yield in order to attract capital. So now let's talk about how we look at the net operating income, and how does Minneapolis-St. Paul market compare to others around the country that investors are looking at. Well, to start with, our rent growth in the Minneapolis-St. Paul market is at the bottom of the top 30 cities in the United States. For affordable housing, the issue is not so much about accelerated rent growth, it's about the certainty of collection from residents who have limited or no income. You may have heard about Beacon Interfaith currently has an initiative at the legislature called Heading Home. It's a $1 billion initiative to expand the amount of rental supports, or vouchers as they are often called, to cover 100% of the renters who qualify. Right now, we are only covering 25% of the renters who qualify. Project-based rental supports stay with the project and allow us to underwrite more debt and equity at the front end because there is more certainty that that rent will be there for the long term. Resident vouchers allow more residents to afford their homes, making them stable for the longer term. Remember when I said half of NOAA renters are cost burdened? Well, the vouchers help to stabilize them and make sure that they will have the funds necessary to afford their rent, which it reduces eviction, reduces the turnover and the vacancy costs for the property that result from that eviction. This has been in discussion for quite some time. We're hopeful that it'll get through this year's legislature successfully, but hope is not a strategy. So if you're talking to people, by all means, lend your support to this need. Property taxes are another part of what drives net operating income. For affordable housing, this is just a head scratcher for me. I bring this up whenever I can. Property taxes are proof that our practice does not align with priority in our community. Currently, affordable housing pays the same property taxes that market rate housing does. A true myth is that, for instance, Aon as a nonprofit doesn't pay property taxes. That is simply not true. We do pay property taxes. In fact, we paid over $10 million in taxes last year alone. And in fact, affordable housing is valued the same as market rate properties, even though they are collecting less rent and oftentimes obligated to collect less rent by restrictive agreement. In fact, affordable housing property types have seen a greater percentage of increase in valuation than any other property type in the last 10 years. That is a demonstration that policy and practice are clearly not aligned. Right now, you can seek to be classified and receive a reduction in property taxes. We call it the 4D tax treatment. You have to restrict your rents for a long period of time in order to make that happen. And we are currently seeking a legislative fix that reduces this, the tax class for all affordable housing to 25%. It's currently in front of the legislature this year. It's been in discussion for 4 years. It came really close last year. It got caught up in the sausage making at the end of the session. So let's hope it goes through. If you want to lend your voice to that, Goff Public is working on the advocacy. And how do affordable housing taxes matter? Market rate, let's look at the context of overall taxes and expenses for all properties in our community, market rate and affordable. Right now, we are among the highest operating cost properties, cities out of 150 that were surveyed throughout the United States. We are among the highest, lowest in rent growth, highest in operating expenses. This means that the yield that an investor is looking at is going to be at the bottom of their choices. Their capital can go anywhere where their yield is high. And remember, with a $14 billion crisis and climbing, we need private capital to want to come to our region. So let's talk about what their decision-making looks like. They have choices in front of them, and they're going to decide to invest or not. The first part of their decision is, should they be investing in apartments? How does that yield compare to other investments they might have available to them in the market, stocks, bonds, equities, etc.? And if they say, all right, we're going to choose to invest in housing, then how does the Twin City market compare to other choices they have throughout the country? And with the slides I just went through, you saw that we are at the bottom of rent growth and the top of operating expenses. Our yield is going to be lower. And let's just assume that we get past that hurdle. They decide they're going to buy multifamily real estate, they're going to do it in the Twin Cities. Then the next part of their decision is, should they be building new or should they be converting NOAA? So it's important as we're, as a community, thinking about setting policy and practice, we need to do it in a way that is aware of and guiding the decisions that investors are making to make them want to choose to support housing in the Twin City area. Which brings me to the what can we do slide. So in summary, because I've spent a lot of time yammering at you here, housing is critical to our regional success. The need we have right now is massive and it's growing. The public resources that we have available are insufficient. The political will is insufficient. We have a regulatory environment that is lowering the yield, and each new decision is factoring into that yield. Yield does matter. We must compete for investors to have them come here. So what can we do to solve for this? We need to build housing. Building today is tomorrow's NOAA. We need to subsidize all kinds of housing construction. We need to fund the gaps that are presented when we try to acquire and preserve NOAA as affordable housing. If we can't solve for the gap in funding, we will continue to lose this housing to market investors at a very quick pace. We need to fix the 4D tax classification so we can bring the cost of operating affordable housing down. We need to fund the vouchers for 100% of the people who qualify for them. And we need to recognize that there is ample private capital available. We just need to incent it to come here. And I've mentioned this before, but I'll end on this note, and that is we need to consider the impact of all of our policies and all of the decisions that we are making as a community on the yield that investors are looking at when they are making their decisions to come here. So I've gone through that really quickly. I'm going to try and figure how to stop sharing here. Have I stopped sharing?
Looks like it's still up.
Well, now, come on. Somebody tell me how to do that. Resume. Oh, here, stop share. You'd think after
There it is.
You'd think after 2 years I would know how to do that, right?
Huge round of applause for Sarah. That was a ton of ground that you just covered in 40 minutes. And thank you for doing so. Looks like we have a lot of questions, so we'll just get through as many as we can pack in here before 3 o'clock. First up is Trom.
Hi, thank you so much. I have 2 questions. I know that at the very last slide you said, let's consider how all policy impacts our market. And I know that last year, the city of Minneapolis hired a team of folks, including Peter Brown, who's a planner and developer consultant here in the Twin Cities, to financially model the impact of various rent caps by creating an example apartment pro forma that was based on actual rents. And what that research found is that rent caps at 75% of CPI and at CPI would have allowed for returns comparable to what was achieved in the middle of the market using measures like cash on cash returns, appreciation, and internal rate of return. And so we have the deep dive of data to show that certain caps wouldn't impact investor returns. And so I'm curious how your analysis differs from the one that was done by the university.
Okay. Well, I have not seen the university's analysis, but what I can tell you is 2 things. First of all, investors need to be swayed by that analysis. And when they have choices looking elsewhere, it may be something they just don't take the time to understand. Secondly, any type of a rent cap needs to be thoughtfully done because all of the different funding sources for affordable housing are already capping rents in different ways. And in some cases, we aren't allowed to commingle all of the different types of income levels. There are some funding sources that only apply to certain funding levels. And so it becomes very difficult to try and work with 12 different competing measures of how rent should be applied in a property. Thirdly, I would just say, I don't know that rent control is or is not the right solution, but what it is a recognition that our community is saying that people are being priced out of housing. And to put in place measures that might have the opposite effect of causing people to not build more housing, to increase the availability of housing, to increase the kind of life cycle of housing that creates the workforce and the NOAA housing is actually having an opposite impact on folks and their ability to find the housing that they need. And so we need to listen to our community saying that it needs more housing, but we need to find more tools to deliver more of the housing that's needed. Simply putting a pinch point on how housing is managed and priced is not solving for the bigger issue, which is we aren't delivering enough housing to keep it priced properly for our community.
Thank you. And then I have another follow-up question. So just going back to NOAA, because I know that Aon does a ton of preservation work with NOAA purchases and rehabs. The conversation around new construction exemption, we know from other cities that creating a new construction exemption incentivizes tear downs of old buildings because, why would you continue to operate a building under rent stabilization when you could just build new. And I'm curious how that would impact Aon's efforts or any preservation buyer's efforts to preserve NOAA. You know, why, if we had an exemption, that would then accelerate the interest in complete tear downs of NOAA. And I'm curious how that has, how that would impact your operations as a preservation buyer.
Well, I mean, I personally think that an exemption needs to also consider properties like NOAA's that have restrictive agreements in place to preserve affordability. So if you're going to exempt new construction, it would be equally helpful to exempt properties that put in place LURAs or LURCs, you know, agreements that say we will keep our rents affordable for a long period of time. But right now, that's not part of the rent control discussion, and it should be.
Thank you. Next up is B.
Thanks, Philip. Thanks, Sarah, for coming in and giving us a piece of your expertise. I'm curious, I don't know if you were present before when I was speaking on my part, but obviously the rising cost of everything is just very much happening right now. And something that you brought up that I thought was very interesting and related to that was the fact that wages have increased 1% while rents have increased by about 14. And the fact that this is happening now, it's clear that we need a solution to keep people in their homes now. And I say that just because you mentioned that building affordable housing takes upwards to 5 years. So I'm curious, like in the meantime, while we're figuring out a lot of solutions to the issues that people are facing now, what other tools do you think would be very much necessary to help not only stabilize communities, but keep people in their homes a lot longer? What tools do you think would be needed for that to happen besides affordable housing? I'm asking that because I know that you are very much an expert in this type of work. So I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are for that.
Well, first of all, I always get nervous when somebody calls me an expert because then I start looking around for where's that expert. But it's pretty simple. It's money, 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 money. You know, our community is investing a ton, community broadly, public sector, private sector, philanthropy, investing a lot of money in those downstream issues like the education gap, like employer recruitment and retention, like crime and safety, like healthcare costs. If we take a small percentage of that money, go upstream and invest those dollars in a way that can move the needle faster, we will be better off, and we will be able to preserve housing in the process by using those funds. The challenge is they bring dollars upstream and they expect a market return on investment. They weren't expecting a return on investment when they were investing the dollars in education and public health and other things downstream. So we need to get that same mentality to go upstream and say that we are going to achieve our return in other ways throughout the community. We need to provide low and no cost money to preserve and build affordable housing for our community. The other thing I would just mention, B, is I did join right as you were talking in the last presentation, and my hat's off to you for navigating what you're navigating. It's great. I would just note that incomes increased 1%, rents went up 14%. We all saw that, right? At the very time that rent control was in the newspaper for St. Paul right before the election last year, did anybody else find it ironic that we were talking about capping rents at 3% while natural gas was going up 24%? So landlords, building owners are in very much the same position that residents are in that our income is being capped or not growing fast enough to keep up with the pace of the cost of operating these buildings. And we are at a breaking point in the community.
I would have to I just have to respectfully disagree with that. I don't necessarily think that what landlords are going through, what developers are going through is necessarily the same as renters and residents, just because as many of us have known and many of us have spoken to residents on the ground, so much of their income is going towards their rent and so much of their income is going towards trying to just keep a roof over their head. And that does not necessarily allow them to and I think Rashida said this in the last slide, that doesn't necessarily let them invest in other parts of their life. So for example, with me, I make enough to get me by, but God forbid I have a medical expense, I am, excuse my French, I'm fucked. And so for me, I don't necessarily see that happening. And yes, I do have a question. I'm getting there. I just needed to bring that up really quick. My question is, how do you think that how do you think that's the same? How do you think that building in a community is the same as a renter not knowing how they're going to pay their groceries, or how they're going to pay their bills, or how they're going to pay for school supplies for their kids? Because those are very, very small things. And while natural gas may increase 24%, it's such a small portion of a rental unit that it doesn't require a 3% increase in rent. So, these are things that I know contribute to the issue that we're facing. But I think that with all due respect, I think it's kind of very disrespectful to the renters to try and compare the two problems as similar. And maybe you weren't trying to do that, but that is just how it came across.
Well, first of all, I really appreciate your honesty and kind of the rawness of what you were experiencing. I completely respect that, and I don't mean to discount that in any way. What I'm trying to say is that on a macro level, right? Like, as a resident, you are experiencing this every day. This is a really tough time. I totally respect that. As a property owner, if our gas prices are going up, if our property taxes are going up, if our labor costs, which they are going up, if our compliance costs are going up, all of these things increasing mean that we don't have the money to replace the roof. And when that roof fails, we are in a very similar position of how do we keep the building operating? If the elevator breaks, if the roof breaks, if we don't have the funds because the rents were capped and we've been spending more and more and more and more to operate that building, we too are saying, where's the money going to come from in order to provide the kind of building that you as a renter deserve to live in, a building that is quality, that is safe, that is airtight, watertight, all of those things. And if we don't have the money to do that, we are not going to be able to provide the housing that the people in our community like yourself deserve. So I don't mean to discount you, B. In fact, I hear your concerns and I am wanting to help solve for them, but it is not as simple as just saying that the landlords or the building owners are the solution, because we too are are experiencing the challenges. And that's why as a community, we need to be looking holistically at the solutions.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Malik, can you do a quick version of your question as we wrap up here?
I'll do my best. I definitely have so much to say, and I'll start out by saying I can appreciate you and your co-presenter, all the information that you guys presented, because you guys both hit the nail on the head. It's not a rental issue. It's an income issue. And the other point that you made is the fact that our rental growth is at the bottom nationwide. Our operating expenses at the top nationwide. So for the gentleman that just spoke before me, to understand that my rents are at the lowest nationwide and my expenses are at the top nationwide, the difference is what I get to keep. And just for context, I got a renter that's been staying on my property since September and I haven't received one single cent. So when she talks about it being extremely similar, the fact that I have issues that I have to figure out, I have 2 children at home, I have a wife with MS at home, I have bills and finances that I need to figure out now being without rent for 8 months. That's not a macro issue, that's a reality issue. I have 8 months less of rent that I was able to collect. But just on another issue, we talked about the rent and it being an income issue. It seems like the city would do a little bit more to preserve the NOAA housing, whether it's in providing vouchers or doing eminent domain to stop that sale from happening and the city purchasing them and turning them into Section 8 housing. That seems like a reasonable solution. And then just one last context, I just needed to get clarification from you. You said that it costs more to build and sustain affordable housing than it does private market housing. I'll also have to disagree with you on that in the aspect of multifamily housing receives a ton of money. You guys get grants, there's subsidies, you get private investors that only want to invest simply to use it as a depreciation to offset their enormous amount of income that they have. So the out-of-pocket expenses, by far, the private investor burdens the majority of a project far more than a than a multifamily new development. So can you talk to me a little bit more about Aon and all the properties? I think it was 2,000 units you said that you guys acquired. Did you guys receive any city funds, grants, or did you guys also receive any private equity investments?
Well, you've asked about 28 questions with less than, well, we don't even have any time left, but
You can just answer the last question.
Okay. We did receive city funds and county funds, but you're mixing the cost to build with the kind of capital that we use to build with. So it costs more to build affordable housing because of some of the compliance and construction requirements that they're required if we use public funds. And then those public funds are not only being used to cover the increased cost of compliance and construction, but they are also being brought to the project in order to cover the gap between what a market rent and an affordable rent can provide in debt and equity. And so they're covering the gap. It's not money that comes into the developer, it's money that makes the numbers work to acquire and to renovate that property. The other thing I would just point out is that operating affordable housing is more expensive than operating private kind of new, because there are, again, compliance requirements. We oftentimes have targeted populations like people with disabilities, people that have experienced long-term homelessness, and there are more services required to keep them in their housing stably. And oftentimes they just turn over more frequently. They leave more often, which increases turnover. It increases vacancy costs and other things. So affordable housing is more complex and more costly to build and more costly to operate than private market housing.
Thanks so much, Sarah. There were two other hands up. We're past our time. Do you have another 5 minutes, or should we wrap here?
Sure.
Okay. And Kelly, I think your hand may have come down, but I saw yours up first, and then
I think my hand was meant to go up and I was clapping, but it meant to be up. Sarah, thank you. And you just answered some that I was going to talk about, but one thing as well, with B's comment, and respectfully, so any investor, whatever size unit that you have on the lending side, I think it's important to know that it's difficult for a developer or a multifamily owner just to simply change their cash flow. What happens is a lender is required, regulated by the Federal Reserve, the OCC, to require certain things on the loans that go out. So once a borrower tweaks that, or they default on that covenant, then we have more issues with that. So it's not, again, that 1.20 we talked about debt service coverage, that's just one covenant that a lender is going to have. And again, we're regulated by the Federal Reserve, the OCC. We don't, as a lender, just get to say, hey, no worries. We hold every borrower to high standards as to making sure that they meet those covenants every year.
Thanks, Kelly. And Monica.
Hi, thank you for your time today. I think maybe it's a question, but probably for a longer answer, and we might not have time. So maybe in the context of comments. One, I know you had mentioned talking about like the long-term affordability factor, and that perhaps rent stabilization should be looking at that. And also just wanted to offer that there's other avenues to look at for long-term affordability commitments and covenants. So I am on the west side of St. Paul. We are the West Side Community Organization over here. I'm also a renter, lifelong resident here in St. Paul. And we have been able to negotiate with developers that are building now, right? Long-term deep affordability covenants to 40 years tied to the deed. And that's a neighborhood organization, with an equitable development scorecard in place that's actually looking at who benefits when development comes in. So I think that there are other avenues to actually to look at that deep long-term affordability, to make that possible for future generations, 40 years, right? Beyond your 15. And then the other thing I just wanted to say is, like, I drive around St. Paul. There are still so many developments under construction along Marshall Avenue, along University Avenue, on Water Street, on Plato Street, and affordable. So what makes their projects more flexible so that they're successful, so that they can adapt to like the changing regulatory environments? And, you know, how can others do the same? Because those buildings are going up now.
Well, and I would just say that those buildings are going up now because they were probably approved and begun before some of the more recent changes. So what will be interesting to see is what kind of gap starts because projects have stopped. We may see, and I use the word may, we may see a pretty big cliff dropping off of the activity for development in St. Paul.
I do know some of these are just recently approved too. So I wouldn't say, we have had some in the last 3 years, but these are very recent. So yeah, we'll have to see how that goes. Thank you.
Thank you again, Sarah, so much. And great appreciation also to Tony, Kelly, and anyone else who may have been involved in pulling this together. And to Trom for working with Rashida at Policy Link for our first hour. Lots of great material. And next week, we'll dig into the St. Paul rental research, and then we will start on our deliberations. Hope everybody has a good week.
Thank you all.
Hey, Trippy, will we be getting some of the resources sent out to us?